We are going to be broadcasting live on Facebook. Carol Wallace is going to be speaking. And right now, this is our crowd, and I am sort of experimenting a little bit with camera angle. Don't mind me, I'm just the tech person. That's loud. That's not the right place for it. All right, enjoy the crowd. I need a table. What's that? Well, that might be it.
A few people circling the block trying to find a parking space, so I'm going to talk real slow. Hopefully you guys will get into and settled before we turn the floor over to Carol. A couple of housekeeping things. If you start to hear heavenly voices, do not worry. The choir is singing downstairs. It's not a sign from above. Okay.
If you are watching, can you please comment about how the sound is?
Those kinds of things, feel free to turn them off or silence them or whatever. One of those housekeeping things. This is a great turnout, and I know a lot of you, but I'm really thrilled to say I don't know all of you, and I'm really tickled about that. My name's Lew Wallace, and I'm the director of the Lew Wallace Museum. And if I don't know you, I hope I meet you soon. Each year, at the General Lew Wallace Study Museum, which is a couple of blocks, east of us here, we do an annual exhibit. And in 2016, it happens to be the bicentennial of Indiana, so we decided to do an exhibit on the golden age of Hoosier authors, Indiana authors. And Lew was a critical part of that. It actually, most researchers, historians, people who look at that, really give Lew Wallace and Ben Hur credit for beginning the golden age. And it ran for almost 50 years. So this year we're looking at that and all the other Hoosier authors that made a difference to that era. And we try to tie our programs each year to whatever the theme is. And so this year all of our programs kind of fall under an umbrella, and we're calling it the Lew Wallace Festival of Words. And this will be about the 8th or 9th program that we've had under that umbrella, Festival of Words. And except for the middle school thing, this is like the best attended thing, so we're really tickled. I think on your chairs there was probably a list that had some of the additional programs that are coming through the end of the year, and we've got some great things. I think Carol will touch a little bit on Ben Hur. That's a book that was written a while back. Howard Miller, who is coming at the end of September, is really recognized as one of the two national experts on Ben Hur, and he's a fun person, so keep that event in mind as well. And then we have the Poet Laureate for the state of Indiana coming in October, Sherry Wagner, so we're really tickled with some of the things that are coming up. Before I introduce Carol, I thought I would tell you how she's related to Lew, because all you've seen in the newspaper, she's the great-great-granddaughter, and actually there's a whole bunch of great-great-granddaughters running around. Right?
Nine that I
Yeah, so there's a bunch of them. Lew and Susan had one son, Henry, so that's easy. Not Henry. Henry had two sons, one of them survived the war, World War I, and that was Lew Jr. And Lew Jr. is Carol's grandfather, because even I get confused. Her father was William Noble Wallace, one of Lew Jr.'s, and this family, I have to tell you, they did not invent new names. There's a whole lot of Williams, there's a whole lot of Lews. But her father, William Noble, was also a writer, and so it's nice to see that tradition continues in the family. William wrote something like 8 or 9 books. I mean, he was published several times. Yeah. Carol has beat him. She's a graduate of both Princeton and Columbia, so her education is not shabby. She lives in New York City with her husband, and she's actually written 20 books, more than 20 books, a lot. She has written, I think your most recent book that I'm aware of, besides one I'll talk about in a moment, is called Leaving Van Gogh. That is a wonderful novel, How to Marry an English Lord, and then a new version of Ben Hur. And I was telling Carol earlier today, I won't ask for a show of hands who's actually read Lew Wallace's Ben Hur. Okay, some of us have, and it's a great book. It can be daunting, and this is Carol's version of Ben Hur, and it is really enjoyable. It follows his storyline extraordinarily well. but she tones down some of the descriptive passages. If you know that Lew took 7 pages to describe an apple, you will appreciate this book. It is really an enjoyable read because the storyline is very true and very accessible. So if you've been a little bit afraid of picking up Lew's Ben Hur, pick up Carol's because it's really an exciting read. A group is produced by Tyndall Press out of Chicago, and they came and they shot a lot of images out of the study and on the ground. So there's a lot of Crawfordsville in the book, and so we really appreciate them doing that, and I really appreciate Carol doing this because I think it's going to open the story to a broader audience that maybe doesn't want to know 3 pages about a red apple. We will have copies available for sale. Carol will autograph and sign them. We've got a nice little display over there. If some of you are here for Ben Hur, I think she'll talk about it. Horses in a, running in a circle, happy ending. Remember, Van Gogh, leaving Van Gogh, guy with 1 ear, sad ending. Some of you are for the English Lord. Edith Mary, she has a happy ending at Downton Abbey, so that was good. I'm actually here because I want to know all about the official Preppy handbook. This is her greatest work. It is absolutely not fiction. This is true. So anyway, this was how I was first introduced to Carol like 45 years ago. And, is that right? Not that much. Maybe 35 years ago. But anyway, this is the first book that I've heard of that she wrote. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carol.
So I'm sitting over there next to Fran, Larry's wife, and she said, he's always been something of a cut-up. Yep, that's right. Thank you. That was a lovely introduction. And I want to say thank you also to all of the staff. Yes, all of you guys. The staff, Amanda, Stephanie, Deb, from the Lew Wallace study. It's been really great to be out here and to meet you guys. I want to make sure everybody can hear me in the back. You all good? Okay. I'm going to try to not talk too fast. So I will probably talk for about 35, 40 minutes. Questions, I'll be happy to answer questions, and then we'll sign a few of these guys. This is most of what I'm going to be talking about. I grew up in Connecticut as a very bookish child. My parents' house was full of books, and we all read all the time. And I thought it was incredibly cool that Lew Wallace was my great-great-grandfather. And I was really impressed. Does any of you remember those landmark biographies for children that you used to see at the library, right? There was a landmark biography of Lew. And I tried to brag about that. And my friends were having none of it. They just did not get why this was such a huge deal. He was a big deal in our house. In part, well, certainly the landmark biography was a big deal. Also, there was stuff from Lew's work and his life all over the house I grew up in, and my parents went to the premiere of the 1959 movie. I would have been 4 at that point. And I guess they brought back a color program from the movie. There might have been, maybe it was a children's book, but my sisters and I literally wore that thing out. And it was in shreds by the time I was 10. And so all of us knew the story of Ben Hur even before we can read. And we read early. But it was just, Lew and Ben Hur was sort of ingrained in our kind of family life. And there were other elements from his life around the house. For example, Dad has, do you guys have the cane? The cane with the gold handle? Yeah. So there was a cane with a very elaborately engraved gold handle that someone had given him. And why, Larry? Why did they give him the cane?
I'm sorry.
Why did they give him the cane?
The cane that we've got with the top on it was from the Battle of
Oh,
Shiloh.
it's the Shiloh, right, okay. There was a letter from Billy the Kid in the back hall of our house, and that was pretty darn cool. And then there was some rather striking jewelry, which, alas, ended up with one of my sisters. I'll have to make you revisit that. And then I was bragging earlier today about the rugs that came back from Constantinople. I'm sure most of you guys know this, but Lew Wallace, in addition to being a Civil War general and an author, had a number of very colorful episodes, one of which was that he was the governor of the New Mexico Territory in a very fraught period when Billy the Kid was just one of the guys who would have liked to slaughter him. And then he was sent to Constantinople as the first minister to the Ottoman Empire. Actually, this is a funny story. Ben Hur had been published, and Lew knew James Garfield, the newly elected president. So, having some sense in his head, he sent a copy of Ben Hur to his friend, the newly elected president, and James Garfield wrote back and said, "Yeah, I'll read it when I have time." And then Lew got a letter just a few weeks later. Garfield had read the book in 5 days as a sitting president. Obviously, times have changed. And it's a long book. It's 550 pages in the original version, so maybe Garfield was a speed reader. And on the basis of Lew's sensitive description of Constantinople, which, if you remember your geography, mine is vague, but I know it's over there. Garfield seems to have thought Constantinople is Jerusalem, kind of the same. I'm going to send, he wrote about Jerusalem, he can go to Turkey now. So he was set as the first minister to the Ottoman Empire. And we got great gloves out of that. But what I want to focus on tonight a little bit is, and Larry alluded to this, is the reason we're all here. Lew wrote 3 books, 3 novels, and his first novel, The Fair God, is not a book whose title you really are likely to know. And his 3rd book, The Prince of India, again, pretty obscure. Ben Hur was one of the biggest literary successes of the 19th and indeed well into the 20th century. So I just want to kind of talk a little bit about what, the nature of that success, and just speculate a little bit about why it was such a successful literary property, which has been and continues to be adapted over and over again, and why people still respond to it all these many, many years later. So we have to start with how Lew came to write the book, which apparently there's now some doubt about this, but the story Lew himself told in his autobiography is that he was on a train to a reunion of Civil War soldiers, and he stepped into a compartment that was occupied by a man named Robert Ingersoll, who was the most famous agnostic in America in the day. Not a job description, one might have thought, but apparently he made a good living out of this. He was an orator in a day when orators were to the public what YouTube is to us. So Ingersoll had a nasty habit of quizzing people when he met them. He would talk to perfect strangers and say, "Well, do you believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ?" And if you said yes, he would say, "Why?" So Lew was subject to this interrogation, and he found that he didn't have any good answers. And as a man who had already published 1 novel, and who had written for most of his adult life, and as a man who loved research, he was just so fond of dredging the archives, he thought, okay, the way I'm going to handle this is I'm going to write a novel that follows a character who lives in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. And as I research and write this novel, I will find out what I think about this claim for Jesus' divinity. So it's one way to solve an issue. Most people wouldn't approach it that way, but that was how Lew had always rolled. So it took him 4 years of research and writing. And during that time, he was in Santa Fe, and here's another funny story. He and his intrepid wife, Susan Elston Wallace, were occupying the Palacio Real, which I'm sure some of you have seen in Santa Fe. It's this long, low building right on the plaza there. And it was, in those days, quite primitive. It had not been renovated since the 17th century. Anyway, someone told Susan one day, you know, you shouldn't let Lew sit in the window doing all that scribbling at night with the lamps on. Someone's going to take a pot shot at him. So they had to like close all the shutters. Anyway, that's where Lew finished writing Ben Hur, and he copied it all out by hand, the story goes, and got on a train and took it to the Harper Brothers in New York City. And this was in the spring of 1880. And the Harper Brothers had made a modest sum on The Fair God, his previous novel, which is about Cortez's invasion, conquest of Mexico. A lot of very unusual names in that book. And Lew's trademark convoluted writing style. So the Harper brother in question said, fine, okay, we'll publish this. And it was expected, the expectations were modest. That's probably the best way to put it. Lew's style of writing was unfashionable for the era. He had always been somewhat out of step with the times. He was really a man of an earlier generation, kind of swashbuckling adventurer. He always wanted the colorful, the lyrical, more poetic kind of life that he had found available to him in, Crawfordsville, Indiana. Particularly as an attorney in Crawfordsville, Indiana, who was deeply in debt to his banker brother-in-law. Life grated on Lew in his middle years. So writing these books like Ben Hur provided him with a tremendous escape. So great, the book was accepted, and the initial sales were quite modest. I think the first 7 months of publication, the book made about $300, which is obviously more back in 1880, but it's not huge. And when he was sent off to Constantinople, he wrote a letter back home in which he told his son Henry that he would be quite satisfied if his 2 novels, The Fair God and Ben Hur, together earned him $1,000 a year thereafter. That would have been terrific for him. But that's not what happened. When he returned from Constantinople in 1885, he came back as a best-selling author. So what happened in between? It's still not easy to pin down. As I mentioned, he's writing against the grain. This is the era of the realist novel, Theodore Dreiser, Stephen Crane. It's, you know, Maggie, a girl of the streets. It's the Red Badge of Courage. People are having a good hard look at the dreariness of life in the slaughterhouses. And Lew is meanwhile swashbuckling around and telling stories of a much more colorful era. So that was, he was writing against the literary grain. And there's another issue, which is that Ben Hur, this is not always easy to remember, the subtitle is A Tale of the Christ. Remember, he's writing this book as an investigation. So in those days, there was a very strong opinion against novels, particularly in the more conservative churches and in the more conservative parts of the country. Fiction was not true. So reading fiction was wasting time. So fiction was frowned upon in many, many hardworking families across America. And then here comes Ben Hur. And it's got a story about Judah Ben Hur and his various adventures, but it also has this extremely strong and very moving thread of narrative about the life of Jesus. And whatever else Lew was able to do in his own writing, he was able to write with real sincerity about the life of Jesus. He took a big risk by portraying Jesus as a character in a novel. He gave him dialogue. That was kind of unheard of. The dialogue was all taken directly from the Gospels. Jesus never says anything that is not between the covers of the Bible. But nevertheless, there he is appearing along with these fictional characters, and it was an unusual combination. Turns out it was also a combination that the American public found very, very moving. And the first groundswell of popularity for Ben Hur comes about really by word of mouth. And apparently you guys have a lot of letters, right? Some of the letters that Lew received. Letters from people who had been estranged from their families or who had lost their lives to drink and had been brought back to the right way by reading Ben Hur. People who were enormously touched by the story. Pastors began recommending it from the pulpits of their churches. People read it out loud to each other. Now, mind you, this is an era in which entertainment is much more thin on the ground than it is for us. So reading out loud around the single oil lamp in your house is pretty standard, but if you have Ben Hur to read, actually you are in pretty good shape because there's a cracking story in there, and that of course is one of the major appeals of this book. So when Lew comes back from Constantinople, he's selling really well. In fact, he was selling at that point well enough to think that it might be worth getting on a train and doing an author tour. And no one's ever said this, I don't know if this is actually true, but surely this has to be one of the first best-selling author tours of the United States. So Lew would go from city to city, and in very large auditoriums, he would speak on Ben Hur. Actually, the lecture that I think sounds interesting was called Turkey and the Turks, which with glimpses of the harem. Bound to disappoint, right? He would fill, like the Brooklyn Academy of Music, for example, was filled to the rafters. There's an auditorium in Syracuse that held 8,000 people. Lew apparently held them spellbound. So we've got a couple things going on here. We have Lew out on the road, we have word of mouth, we have preachers speaking about his book. And then there's another thing that starts to happen, which is as early as 1882, requests started to come in to Lew for permission to perform the book. And in those days, of course, very, very low tech. So we're talking about little skits or tableau, pageants of a kind with musical interludes. There are several stretches of poetry or song in the original Ben Hur. They are not in my book. So Lew actually wrote a libretto and gave some permissions for people to perform. But of course, the pageants and the songs weren't what people were really after. And eventually, stage producers started to come to Lew and to his son Henry, who was by that point managing a great deal of his literary business. And they really, really wanted to put Ben Hur on the stage. Henry Wallace had the great good sense to hold out until he felt that stage technology could really do justice to the sweeping story of Ben Hur. And so by 1899, this had occurred, and Ben Hur was on Broadway in an enormously popular play that ran for 20 years. Millions of people saw it, and of course, one of the big attractions was the chariot race, which they managed with treadmills. And actually, one of my favorite things about that is that there were real live horses on the stage. Lew, who was a great horseman, had loaned one of his own 3-year-olds that he had bred to the production. The horse's name was Monk. Monk was the first horse to learn how to run on the treadmill. And when the show closed 20 years later, Monk was the only surviving cast member who was still on stage. So there was an English producer who was there at one of the last dress rehearsals thinking about bringing this production to London. So he sat through the dress rehearsal, and at the end of it, he said to one of the US producers, "The American public will never stand for Christ and a horse race in the same show." But you know, I think one of the things is that that's just exactly what the American public wanted, and in some cases maybe still does want. In 1904, Ben Hur was part of the St. Louis World's Fair. Think about those thousands of people who saw that. Bits from the chariot race appeared in the Barnum Bailey Circus and in the Pasadena Rose Parade. So the innate drama in this book, which is very clearly there on the page, took on a whole new life with each new performing technology, which brings us, of course, to the film. The first film, which, was it used? Yeah, Stephanie says she's seen. It's on YouTube, Stephanie says. 1907, short, filmed in New York City. The players are, it's silent, of course. The players are wearing costumes borrowed from the opera, and they shot part of the chariot race on a beach, which is still there. It did not last long because the producers hadn't paid for the rights, so they had to take it away pretty quickly. But film was inevitable, right? This was such a sweeping story that sooner or later it was going to come to the stage. And I've been hearing this evening about the 1925 version, which, according to Larry Perlberg over there, is one of the finest silent films ever made. So obviously when I go home, the first thing I'm going to do is watch that. It starred Ramon Navarro as Ben Hur, and I can tell you that when my grandmother went to the 1959 premiere, she didn't want to look at Charlton Heston. She had eyes only for Ramon Navarro. The rights for that book sold for a vast sum of money, and it was a huge production. Meanwhile, with the plays and the movies, the books keep on selling. And by 1908, there were close to 1 million copies of Ben Hur in print in hardcover because there weren't that many paperbacks yet. And then at the same time, what's happening in America is, if you think about it, it's the development of a nationwide commercial culture, right? So as transportation makes it easier to get goods across the country, and as brands start to standardize, advertising becomes more and more important, and many products chose to link themselves with some name that everyone knew. And in many surprising cases, that name was Ben Hur. If you get on eBay, you will be shocked at the number of doodads you can find that have the Ben Hur name on them. Some of them make sense. Tents, okay, I get it. Bicycles, anything related to speed, sleds, tires, Ben Hur. There was a life insurance situation that confuses me to this day. There were spices. Well, that makes sense because Ben Hur is all about the exotic. There's a pair, I love them so much, of diamond barrettes. You might check and see if they're still there when I leave, actually. They look so good. In the study that are Ben Hur diamond barrettes. I mean, because of the lovely, the two competing ladies in the book. So that's another issue, another point that sort of keeps this whole idea alive. And it just kept on going. So if we back away then from the products, from the book, from the movies, and think about the story, because that maybe is at the heart of the whole thing. And it's a story of heroism. It's a story that has considerable violence in it. I was quite shocked. I had not actually read, I have to confess this, I had not read Ben Hur in its full length until I began doing this rewriting project, which I'll get to that shortly. And I was really startled. I mean, I don't remember how many people Judah Ben Hur actually kills, but it's quite a few, and he's pretty indiscriminate. I forget that Lew was first and foremost a soldier. He got his first training in an environment that I think is really, really hard for us to imagine. I mean, when you think about the Civil War and how brutal it was and how visceral it was, and that's something that most readers of this book would never know. So that was one of the things that I think people were in a way drawn to because it was a vicarious experience they didn't get any other way. Another part of the story that I think struck a chord, at least in the 1880s, is that as the country is starting to recover from the Civil War, one of the very important storylines of Ben Hur is slavery, because our hero, Judah Ben Hur, goes from being a pampered prince to being a slave in a Roman galley, and this is a very, very dark and devastating portion of the book. Lew is really, as he writes it, he's hammering home in very sensory ways the compression, the odors, the despair, the effort, the gloom. And I think that readers, perhaps, whether they knew it or not, in the 1880s and 90s are able to connect this material to some of what they're starting to learn about slavery. So Ben Hur kind of is mirroring the conditions of the time, and I think that is maybe one of the issues that kept it alive. Another part is that this was also a period of enormous prosperity in our country as the industrial culture that we know and love really started to rattle into gear, right, in the late 19th century. Well, Lew Wallace was a man who knew hardship. He spent a lot of his middle years of his life owing a lot of people a lot of money. And he writes about riches almost lasciviously. In the course of Ben Hur, poor Judah Ben Hur goes from being a prince to being a galley slave, and then all of a sudden somebody gives him a fortune, and then whoops, there's another one. In the end of the book, he's got more money than he knows what to do with. And I think readers kind of like that when their hero gets rich, he's done all the right things, and he's getting rich too. It's like, yeah, you go, guy. Another part of the story that isn't discussed much, he's got two girls on the go, too. There's not one girlfriend, but there are two, and the second girlfriend is actually more interesting because she's a bad girl, and she's cut out of most of the movie versions. I mean, she exists in 1925 wearing a platinum frizz wig. I guess the height of sex appeal, I don't know. But she's nowhere in 1959, and she is not in the 2016 version either. But she's great, because she's like slinks around, and she wears too much perfume, and Lew is obviously Lew. Judah Ben Hur, or Lew being Judah Ben Hur, is obviously really drawn to this kind of overstated sexuality that was probably not really readily available to him. So, or to anybody in 1880. Probably not in Santa Fe anyway. So I think that was part of it too. So, you know, the basic situation I think is that, you know, there are all of these different threads that we can look at that contributed to the initial success of the book, and then ultimately there's something that happens. It happened with the Preppy Handbook. It did, and it also happened with Downton Abbey. There's a thing that happens where you have a viable cultural product that's good, really good of its kind, and then somehow it gets caught up in a machine, in some kind of, I don't even have a word for it. It gets caught up in a swell of popularity. That Hamilton, for example. Hamilton's a good musical. Okay, yeah, it's really good. Is it all that? Could it be? I don't know. I mean, it just, so I think that Ben Hur in some ways is like the Hamilton of its era. Which maybe is my segue to how I got involved in this job, which obviously has to do with the 2016 film, the one that just released and that has been so hammered by the critics. I had actually been thinking about adapting Ben Hur, bringing it up to date, partly because I think there are a lot of 19th century novels that have great stories buried inside excess verbiage. And, I mean, you know, Dumas, The Three Musketeers, I mean, it's so great. And it didn't escape my mind either that these books are in the public domain, and if someone brought them up to date and copyrighted them, there might be some money in it. So Ben Hur was kind of on my mind for that reason. And then I had a Google alert out for it, and I started to see these pings about a film version. This would be a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago. And I thought, well, you know, if there's going to be a movie, that's all the better, and maybe I could, you know, get on that movie's coattails somehow. My husband works for a magazine called Guideposts, which some of you may know. And he has interviewed, written pieces about a producing couple named Mark Burnett and Roma Downey. Roma was the angel in Touched by an Angel. Mark Burnett produces Survivor, Shark Tank? One of those music ones. Anyway, Mark and Roma are serious friends. So Rick basically ran into someone. Rick introduced me to someone who knew Mark and Roma, and just as they were looking for a writer for the book tie-in, I swam into their consciousness. And Roma's Irish, and she's very. She kept saying, "It's providential that you came to us," which fine, you know, providential. Yeah, that's fine with me. So I was given the brief to write a new version of the book. I was to go back to Lew's original. I never saw the screenplay. My book did not track and does not track the screenplay. Now I understand that part of what they wanted was they've been positioning this third, fourth version as being going all the way back. It's not a remake of 1959, it's a revisiting of Lew Wallace's best-selling 1880 novel. Hence me, with my last name, Wallace. And I didn't really figure out what this meant or why it was important until Rick and I got to go to visit the set in Rome, which just kind of came up all of a sudden. I was in church one, you know, Maundy Thursday, and I got up off my knees and my phone was exploding, and it's like, can you come to Rome on Tuesday? Oh, I think so. So we went to the set, and we had no idea what to expect, and we got off the plane, and there's this shiny black car And guess what? It was just like the movies. It was all shiny black cars and champagne. And seriously, there was like a PR person for each of us. And we got to the set, and there were all these people milling around looking at the chariots which were being built. And before I knew it, there were cameras everywhere on me. And there was a sound boom, and there was a video camera. And I had on my ugly pink sneakers, and I just... I should have understood at that point that what they wanted with me was legitimacy, to some extent. And that has been true all along. Fine. Happy to oblige. Anything I can do for you guys. Because the truth of the matter is, this has been a really, really fun gig, every step of the way. Yeah, did I get to meet Jack Houston? Yes, I did. Did he kiss me on the cheek? Yes, he did. He was adorable. You know, did I chum around with the director, who is this terrifying-looking tough guy named Timur Bekmambetov? Yes, Timur and I are like this. But you know, it's just we went to the opening. We were on the red carpet. You know. Things I never thought would happen, and it's been just the purest pleasure. And then writing the book was really, really, really fun. Here's why. I didn't have to do the hard work. Lew had done the hard work. So my biggest job was to make it readable for 21st century readers. And the first thing I did was just cut probably 30% of it, because there's a lot, as Larry said, a lot of description. These were days, Lew was writing in days when there were not even many photographs available of Jerusalem. Oasis, chariot, gladiator. I say those words, you have an image in your head. That was not true in 1880. So Lew had a lot of catching up to do, and people really liked that stuff. I can just say gladiator and move on. And so that's what I did, and I got a lot of extra out of the book that way. And I did make the women's parts more interesting. There are quite a few women, and I got into their heads more. I sped the darn thing up. The chariot race was terrifying. It just was. In the original book, it's not very long. Also, I don't have a really linear mind, so I kept having to make maps. Like, you know, here's the stadium, and here's this one, and that one, and I still screwed it up. My husband read the manuscript, and he had 2 corrections, both having to do with the chariot race. One, I had put eucalyptus trees on the outside, and he said, honey, eucalyptus trees didn't leave Australia until 1830. Thank you. And the other one is that I had these shadows falling across the track as the race went on. And he said, and by the way, they're racing, right? So they're going fast, right? And the shadows are moving, and I thought, oh, that's right. And then I remembered that I realized that I had based the chariot race in my head on sitting at the Rose Bowl, where there are eucalyptus trees, and you're sitting there for 3.5 mortal hours, and the shadows do move. So we had to change that. But that's a real minor thing. So it's been a tremendously fun and enjoyable process all along. And of course, one of the things that is a side benefit is coming to talk to people like you who think that guy is as cool as I thought he was when I was a little kid. So thank you very much for being here. I would be happy to answer questions. Yes, back.
I know nothing about this, but I'm assuming the book was translated into other languages. Is that true?
You mean now or then? Then?
Well, then.
Yes. Oh, I'm sure. Yes. You know, one of the things that happened as I was growing up is that people would give us copies of it, because there were so many, and they'd find them at book sales, and they only cost 5 cents. So we'd have like all these copies. So yes, now I think of it, there are, and there were many in foreign languages, yes. And in fact, even now, in this new edition, I know it was translated into Portuguese and German, and there's some Chinese language, but I don't know which. So yes, it's popular worldwide. Yeah. Come on, guys. Yes, back.
Hi, well,
Thank you.
did you, you said that Lew was a soldier at heart, and then did his life radically change once he became a bestseller in 1905? And would he close and live to balance his life as a celebrity with wealth?
Oh, it changed enormously. Actually, Larry's the guy who could really talk about that. But yes, his life did change a great deal. I mean, you become a celebrity, right? So, you know, there was a lot of solicitation to write things. He was a big deal. People asked him to give more talks, to do speeches. And I think also what you don't necessarily think about as you're at the creative end of a project like this, you're thinking about getting your book finished, right? But if you are the curator or the owner of a product like Ben Hur, it's a lot of business. Protecting your rights and making sure that your story is told the way you want it to is a huge amount of work. And so, yes, it was a completely different world thereafter. And of course, he built the study on the earnings from Ben Hur, yes?
Well, it seems like a real, well, I don't know his history, but real quiet, reserved sort of guy, so I imagine, did he get overwhelmed by all that celebrity?
You know, I think you should talk to Larry about that, because he's...
Well, you know him, did you?
Yeah. I may be old, but... Anybody, that's on the other hand, yes?
Maybe a little early yet, but we've got the movie coming out, and you've rewritten the story. Can you tell the reception? Is there going to be a new era of Ben Hur fans, or what do you think?
That's a really good question. So, the movie has not been very warmly received. In fact, there was, it's been pretty poorly received. So I'll be very curious to see how long actually it's in movie theaters. It's that big a, that's the situation. I know that Mark and Roma were really hoping that with the chariot race and has any of you guys seen the new movie yet? See, a bunch of you guys have seen the new movie. So, okay, so the chariot race is great, right? Yes. And how about that galley battle? Yeah. I mean, the war, that stuff is really, really good. The thinking was that you get the teenage boys in for the chariot race, and then they get Jesus too. But I don't know if that really happened. And I think I'm kind of astonished that you guys have all seen it, because if you, I think the audience penetration has been pretty diminished. So we can hope. Yes, Larry.
I was going to say also, Paramount has developed a documentary on the making of Ben Hur. And one of the things I was telling somebody is that the book itself did not start out as a blockbuster. It took a little while to get legs under it. And the 1925 movie, it took 6 years before it made any money at all for MGM. It was a slow, out-of-the-chute kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see if this 2016, because it's not a bad movie. It's very exciting scenes. The acting is fine. I think, personally, where they strayed from the book and from Carol's version is where they lost some of the momentum. But just making a TV documentary, who knows what kind of audience they may begin to build over time.
I suppose that's true. We are also in a period now when nothing's ever really gone. So, you know, it may end up that way. There could be an extra, who knows. It's sort of unpredictable.
Cult classic.
It's a classic, yes.
Hi. Jim Madison, who's emeritus professor of history at IU, has just written this fantastic new book for the bicentennial of the state of Indiana. And in the chapter on the Civil War, he talks about Lew. Mm-hmm. And he argues in his book that Ben Hur is nothing but a thinly veiled autobiography, that it was his attempt to resurrect that that everything in the book parallels his career after
Charlotte.
Shiloh.
Yeah.
And that everything
yeah.
was done, if you follow the book, that it's,
This is, so this is it's a pretty irresistible conclusion. So, as I'm sure most of you know, Lew was on the fast track to be well, he was a general at the age of what, 37?
Yeah.
37. So he had a really promising military career until the Battle of Shiloh, where he was called up to the front by General Grant and did not appear until 6 p.m. that day. And that was a disaster for him. And his, all of his military promise just drained out of it. There's a lot to be said about that. I am not an expert. Larry's definitely a much better version of this than I am. But there is a theory, and it makes a lot of, I mean, as a writer, I can see how this would be the case. The theory that the crucial moment in Ben Hur, the book, is where Judah Ben Hur knocks a tile off his roof, it whacks the Roman on the head, and it's all downhill from there. So that is, in a way, Judah Ben Hur's Shiloh, and the rest of the book is redemption. So yeah, I think that's completely reasonable. I read that theory first in Slate. A guy named John Swanberg aired that idea in, I think, 2000. What's the census? 13, 14?
I think it was 13.
13, right. Very well written. So yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Anybody else? Come on, don't be shy. Yes.
You mentioned Lew's wonderful wife, Susan, in one word, intrepid, but she was your great-grandmother. Do you have family stories?
You know, she is a pretty silent voice, actually. He's great, so that's a long way. And he, of course, this is the secret, guys, write it all down, because if you're writing it down, then your voice endures. Susan was a commercial writer, but she, you know, I really didn't know much about her at all. I have an aunt named Susan after her, but other than that, I didn't know much about her at all until I began doing some background research for my version of Ben Hur. And she sounds like a really intelligent, humorous, entertaining woman who put up with, I think Lew was probably pretty hard to be married to, but I think he also appreciated her enormously. And she had an adventurous streak of her own. So I think they were probably very well matched. Yes?
I don't know if you've been to the Carnegie Museum here in town, but there's her piano is there.
Did not know that.
Her piano is there, and there's a wonderful legendary story, probably apocryphal, that she was playing the piano, which had been brought around the Gulf of Mexico and up the Mississippi River.
They all were.
And to the Wabash, and then finally Sugar Creek, and then it was transported to the Elston homestead. And he was passing by and heard her playing the piano, and it was the beginning of their romance.
Could be. Who's to say no?
It's a nice story.
It's a lovely story. I like that. Yeah, exactly.
But the piano's there.
The piano's there. Okay, good. Is it still in tune?
It's not true, but it could be restored. I once made a valiant attempt to raise money to do it, didn't succeed.
Well. Anything else?
I have another story.
Yes, that's fine, yeah.
The second story is that I was in Rome at a conference, and one day all museums were closed, chaperone strikes, and so, typical. And so I decided to take a bus tour, and I went all around Rome and saw places I had not imagined seeing on foot or by subway. And finally wound up at the Circus Maximus, and there the woman who was giving, the Italian woman who was giving the tour, and who spoke very broken English. She spoke first in Italian, then she'd give it in English. And this is where the wonderful chariot race was for Ben Hur. So I thought, well, that's marvelous. So we got to the end of the tour at Piazza Venezia, and I climbed out, and then I went back and I said, do you know where Lew Wallace's study is? And where Ben Hur became so famous? And she said, no, senor. I said, Crawfordsville, Indiana. And she went, huh?
All right, guys. Well, thank you very much. I will be signing books after. television.